Hello everyone, thank you for coming back to the channel. This is episode 2 of the Boys Book of Sea Battles. Today our story focuses on, let's get that page turned, Commodore John Paul Jones. And we can see one of the maps here. It says Jones' victory over the Serapis. It's got Bonhomme Richard, Serapis, Palos, Countess of Scarborough, Alliance, Vengeance, Escaping British Convoy, and the various icons there. Irish Sea, North Sea, and England here in the middle. And it says engagement of the Bonhomme Richard and the Serapis. Commodore John Paul Jones. John Paul Jones was a man of no one country, a citizen of the world, a fighter on the side of humanity, the bitter enemy of the brutal oppressor. Likewise, he was a Scottish trader, an American commodore, a French chevalier, a Russian admiral, the father of the United States Navy, and the winner of the greatest sea battle of the Revolutionary War. Jones had been called the Drake of the New World. Like Drake, he was a man of strong individuality, a dashing adventurer, a gracious courtier, a brilliant commander, a strict disciplinarian, a tender-hearted and loyal friend, a ferocious avenger, an invincible fighter. Unlike Drake, he was not a pirate. Jones was hated by the British, as Drake had been hated by the Spanish. John Paul was born on July 6, 1747, at Arbigland, on the southern shore of Scotland. His father was a lowlander, head gardener and gamekeeper to a country squire, while his mother was a Highlander and a descendant of one of the fierce hill clans. Jones was the youngest of 7 children. His oldest brother, William, was adopted by a distant relative. William Jones, who had emigrated to Virginia, the adopted lad at once took the name of Jones. Little John Paul himself had never seen this brother, as he had been born 3 years after William departed. John Paul soon grew into a hardy, active, self-reliant lad. At 12, his scanty instruction in the parish school of Kirkbean ended. Then Jones, who loved the sea and sailing, begged his father to let him go to sea. So his father sent him across the Solway and apprenticed him to James Younger, a prosperous merchant in the American trade. As master's apprentice, John Paul was now a full-fledged sailor on board the Friendship. A month later, after the stormy voyage, this vessel dropped anchor in the Rappahannock River, not far from the plantation of William Jones, the relative who had adopted his eldest brother. John Paul found William Paul Jones a successful married man and overseer of his adopted father's plantation. While the Friendship lay at anchor, the young boy spent much time on land with his brother and became attracted to the novel and independent life of the American colonists, a life that had a particularly strong appeal for his own rugged spirit. William Jones took a fancy to the lad and offered to adopt him. But while a lively interest in the half-civilized new country had been awakened, John Paul's real love was for the sea. He therefore declined and soon sailed for home. For the next 6 years, John Paul sailed on trading voyages in the ships of Mr. Younger. He learned his trade quickly, for he had a keen mind and a retentive memory. In 1764, he was serving as second mate on West Indian traders. A year later, he was promoted to first mate. Then Mr. Younger retired from business, released him from his indentures, and gave him a 6th interest in the packet engaged in West Indian trade. This packet was the King George. In this vessel, John Paul made 2 voyages to the west coast of Africa after slaves. At the end of his second voyage, our hero sold his share in the vessel, and at Kingston, Jamaica, he boarded the John O'Gaunt as a passenger bound for Whitehaven. The ship was infected with yellow fever. Barely had she cleared the Windward Islands before the ravages of the scourge began to spread among the crew. Within a week, the captain, his officers, and most of the deckhands had died. Only 6 human beings were left on the ill-fated ship. One was John Paul, the passenger. John Paul took command. He guided the fever-stricken ship across the dangerous waters of the Atlantic and brought her safely into the harbor at Whitehaven. So pleased were her owners, Curie, Beck, and Company, that they gave him a generous monetary reward and appointed him captain and supercargo of a new ship, the John, which was engaged in making trips to the West Indies. In command of this vessel, John Paul made 3 voyages. During the course of these, he again visited his brother on the Rappahannock, and the bonds of affection for America were drawn still closer. When William Jones died in 1773, he left his entire property of 3,000 acres, buildings, slaves, cattle, and a sloop to his adopted son. The will provided that, should the adopted son die without children, the property was to go to his youngest brother, John Paul. William died 2 years later. At William's death, John Paul became master of the large estate in Virginia. He decided to assume the name of Jones and sent his ship home to England under the command of his first mate, with word to her owners that he intended to become a colonial planter. For more than 2 years, he enjoyed the quiet and independence of his new life. During this period, he left the active management of the estate to his brother's faithful overseer and devoted the greater share of his own time to study and society. He mastered French and Spanish, naval history and tactics, diplomacy and politics. He entertained the neighboring families with lavish hospitality and traveled extensively. The poor Scottish gardener's son, self-educated, had become a scholarly American. The Drake and the Ranger. In the spring of 1775, John Paul Jones made his way in his sloop along the coast of New Jersey on a pleasure sail to Boston. He stopped at New York to see his friend William Livingston, who gave him the bad news that fighting had broken out between the British and the colonists. "John, my friend, word has just come that the British have beaten us at Lexington," Livingston told him. Jones immediately gave up his plans for going to Boston. He turned the bow of his sloop homeward, and 3 days later he wrote Hughes and other members of the Continental Congress offering his services. In June, the new Marine Committee invited him to submit any information and advice he could on the selection of suitable naval officers and ships for the beginning of a navy with which to defend the American seaboard. The first squadron of our navy comprised 4 ships, the frigates Alfred and Columbus, and the brigantines Andrea Doria and Cabot. The first list of officers consisted of 5 captains, 5 first lieutenants, and 8 junior lieutenants. In this list, John Paul Jones stood at the head of the first lieutenants. Favoritism among some of the powerful members of the Marine Committee kept him out of the list of captains. The American squadron was ready for sea on February 17th. On that day, the light, sleek ships sailed out of Delaware Bay and headed for the Bahama Islands. Almost 2 months later, the squadron returned to home shores after a cruise that was productive of little more than a showing of disgraceful incompetence on the part of many of the officers. As a result, captains appointed through influence and favoritism were dismissed, while Jones was honorably retained and given an independent command. Jones was placed in command of the Providence, a small 14-gun sloop. He ran troops and supplies between New London and New York. Then he made a 6 weeks voyage along the coast from Bermuda to Nova Scotia to harass British commerce. He destroyed fisheries and captured 16 English ships. Near Bermuda, he met the British ship Solebay of 28 9-pounders. For 6 hours, he was chased by the more powerful enemy, but by a clever maneuver that surprised and caught the Britisher at a disadvantage, the American frigate escaped. Believing that he could be of much more service to the American cause in foreign waters than at home, Jones appealed for permission to sail to the English and Irish channels. Final recognition came from General Washington himself, who said, "Captain Jones, you have conceived the right project, and you are the right man to execute it." The result was an appointment to command the new sloop of war, Ranger, which carried 26-pounders. The Scotch Commodore was told to be ready for a trip to France to carry dispatches of the highest importance. The Ranger sailed on November 1st, 1777. The news she carried was the surrender of Burgundy at Saratoga. Spreading every inch of canvas that he could, Jones forced his ship through the Atlantic at topmost speed. By day, the stanch little Ranger staggered on in the teeth of heavy northeast winds and blinding snow squalls. By night, she beat her way through darkness and blanket fog. On December 2nd, she sailed into the Loire and dropped anchor at Nantes. Commodore Jones hurried to Paris with his packet of news, only to find that he had been outstripped. A Mr. Austin, who had sailed from Boston 2 days earlier with duplicate messages, had arrived just 24 hours before. But this was not the only disappointment to greet Jones in Europe. He had been promised a large new frigate, built at a neutral Dutch dockyard for the United States. On reaching Paris, he discovered that the vessel, for political reasons, had been sold to France. So instead of starting on his long-cherished cruise in British waters on the deck of a 46-gun frigate, he was forced to use his little sloop. Nobody but a dauntless commander and an equally dauntless crew would ever have thought of heading toward England with such a small ship. Jones gave his ship a thorough refitting, and early in February, he sailed into the harbor of Brest. A dense mass of ship's rigging filled the roadstead. Jones saw that it was the great French fleet under Count d'Orvilliers, bent upon upholding the honor of the new American flag, which was flying from his masthead. Jones asked, as a condition of his entering the port, that a salute be given his colors. His request was granted. As he passed through the lanes of heavy battleships, the French guns roared out the first salute ever given by a foreign navy to the flag of the United States of America. Just 1 week earlier, the Treaty of Alliance between France and the United States had been signed at Versailles. The salute to the flag was a seal to the treaty. On April 24th, the Ranger met the British sloop Drake off the north coast of Ireland. The Drake spotted the Ranger and sent a scout to reconnoiter her. The Ranger immediately captured the scout. When the Drake sailed out of the harbor to investigate, Jones had the American flag flying from the masthead of the Ranger. "Ahoy! What ship is that?" bawled the British captain. It was an unnecessary inquiry. The answer was equally unnecessary, but it came. "The American continental ship Ranger. Come on, we are waiting for you." The Americans opened fire at close range. The British retaliated. For over an hour, the battle raged. The Drake was cut to ribbons, and her commander was killed. She downed her colors, and the Americans boarded her. The capture of the Drake was the first brilliant naval success of the war. The ships themselves were small and unimportant, but a great moral victory had been won. The triumphant cruise of the tiny ship was the dramatic beginning of the tiny American Navy. The English were surprised into respect for American sea power. It gratified and won the admiration of France, the foe of Britain and friend of America. And most important of all, it brought to the colonists in the new republic new courage, new confidence, and new strength. The Bonhomme Richard and the Serapis. When he reached Brest with his prize, the first trophy of the war to reach France, John Paul Jones found his own vessel in such a deplorable state that he saw it would take weeks to put it into fighting condition. The Continental Congress was too poor to give him any money, so he sold the captured Drake to France. The United States was angered at the sale and removed Jones from his command. The Ranger sailed home without him. John Paul Jones had two powerful friends in France. They were the Duke de Chartres, eldest son of the Duke d'Orleans, and his wife, the Duchess of Chartres. Although through them, he was able to persuade the king to provide him with a 40-gun ship, the Ladurus. She was a very old craft. She was not much better than a makeshift warship, for her batteries were mounted with the discarded guns of the French government. Old, rusty, loose-jointed relics that were liable to blow to pieces when fired with a heavy charge. His crew, too, was a motley bunch. Of the 375 men whom he was able to collect, only 50 were Americans. The rest were French, Portuguese, and British. Fortunately, before he sailed, the exchange of British and American prisoners of war gave him the chance to replace some of his alien seamen with 114 Americans. All arrangements were completed in August 1779. By that time, the Ladurus, whose name Jones had changed to Bonhomme Richard as a compliment to Benjamin Franklin, had been converted into a fairly efficient-looking man of war. Besides the Bonhomme Richard, the squadron consisted of several smaller vessels, all commanded and crewed by Frenchmen. There was the Alliance, under Captain Landy, a frigate of 36 guns, the Pallas, a frigate of 28 guns, the Vengeance, a brig of 12 guns. All except the Alliance belonged to the king, and the French money paid the expenses of the expedition. Yet the ships sailed and the men fought under the American flag, and the French officers were, for the time being, commissioned officers of the United States. Commodore Jones was looked upon as an irresponsible adventurer by most of the French officers. They were jealous of the praise he had won from France. There was a good deal of discontent. The squadron set sail for Lorient. The projected cruise was to cover a circle around the British Islands and end at the Texel. Through calms and gales and shifting winds, John Paul Jones worked his way up the west coast of Scotland and then beat down the east coast as far as the Firth of Forth. Finally, he reached Spurn Head. In the meantime, a number of seamen had deserted. Most of the captains had tried to rebel, and Captain Landy had deserted together with his ship, the Alliance. In spite of these drawbacks, Jones captured several ships and sent them to friendly ports. Jones discovered in September that a British fleet with naval stores was heading for England and had arrived at Bridlington Bay. Jones jumped at the chance to attack the large convoy. He headed north to meet the British. They met just north of Bridlington. The British merchant ships crowded together, and their convoys moved out to protect their retreat. Jones signaled to his other ships to give chase, but the Alliance refused to move. The captain of the Alliance even signaled the smaller Vengeance. The Vengeance obeyed the order of the rebellious Captain Landy. Only the Pallas followed the Bonhomme Richard. The British escort ships were the Serapis, a new 44-gun frigate, and the sloop of war, Countess of Scarborough. Captain Contino of the Pallas gave chase to the sloop, which was running out to leeward, and during the coming fight he was so fully occupied in capturing her that he could render no assistance to his commander-in-chief. So Commodore Jones was left single-handed to face the formidable British Serapis. Left to fight it out on an old rotten hulk that should have been made into firewood long before. To make matters worse, his crew was foreign and unskilled and uncooperative, while Captain Pearson of the Serapis had highly trained men. That this fight resulted in a victory for Jones is one of the most remarkable tributes to the generalship and fighting qualities of the man that could ever be paid him. It was 7 o'clock in the evening before the two vessels came within striking distance. As the Bonhomme Richard came up, Captain Pearson sent a shot whistling toward her. There was no answer. Then he hailed again with another whistling shot. This time there was an answer. A broadside was fired at the Serapis. Captain Pearson now knew that his enemy was John Paul Jones. The ships were within 600 feet of one another. A light but steady wind was blowing from the southwest. The sea was smooth and comparatively peaceful. Both ships opened fire. The surroundings were bathed in the livid light of flashing gunpowder. The contesting ships stood out like grim black specters. The night air was split and shattered by the crash of cannon, the roar of mortar, the rattle of guns, the crash of mast, the splintering of hull, the wild and triumphant cries of men, and the hoarse shouts of alarm and death shrieks of other men. Suddenly, there was a rending roar from the Bonhomme Richard. Riven with rust pits, weakened from long usage, two of the Richard's old 18-pounders had burst. They had formed a part of the steerage battery, just under the main deck aft. The explosion killed or wounded most of the gun crews and demoralized the crews of the four remaining 18-pounders. They refused to risk their lives longer in firing them. Jones ordered the Bonhomme Richard to drift closer to her antagonist. As the distance between them decreased, the deadliness of fire of both vessels increased. Now pistols could be used. The rotten timbers of the American ship were a pincushion for the projectiles of the British gunners. They stuck in the old hull everywhere, cutting gaping holes in the ship. But the Serapis was damaged also. Her hull showed many marks of well-aimed shot. Her decks were littered with dead and wounded. The ships drifted slowly apart, still fighting madly, lead raining down upon crews. 9 of the Richard's 12-pounders had been abandoned. 80 men of the main battery had been struck down. The wreckage of rigging and cabin was scattered everywhere. Wounded men lay on the decks. They propped themselves against every conceivable support. The living and unhurt, with bodies black from powder marks, ran wildly from point to point, loading and firing their guns. The hull had been pierced by several heavy cannonballs, and the water was pouring in. Jones shouted to Lieutenant Richard Dale to close in on the Serapis. If the Bonhomme Richard were to survive the battle, it would have to make an all-out attack right away. It was his last chance, his only hope. He rounded the bow of the Serapis and suddenly came in upon her. The enemy ship's jib boom ran over the Bonhomme Richard's poop deck. Before it could get away, 2 of the American sailors had seized it, and Jones himself jumped up and lashed it fast to his ship's mizzenmast. This brought both ships together side by side. Their cannons all but touched. The starboard anchor of the Serapis was hooked in the Richard's mizzen chains. It was a secure lock. The rest of that furious fight would be hand-to-hand struggle. Some of his officers came up to John Paul Jones and attempted to persuade him to strike his colors. A fear-crazed under-officer shouted loudly to the British frigate, "Serapis ahoy! Will your commander grant us quarter?" Jones turned upon the officer savagely, but before he could knock him down, Captain Pearson hailed him. "Does your commander himself call for quarter?" asked the British captain. Glancing up to his masthead, Jones saw that his ensign had been shot away. Stepping forward on the poop deck, he called back, "Quarter nothing! We have just begun to fight." Commodore Jones now sprang on the quarterdeck and rallied his men to the battery. He shifted over one of the guns himself and directed the fire. Then he dashed among the French Marines, cheering and exhorting them in their own tongue. To win the battle, Jones had to clear the enemy's decks. The Serapis was keeping the Bonhomme Richard afloat, and if the British should succeed in freeing their ship from the locked position, the American ship would sink. Jones directed part of this crew to keep the lashings secure. The rest were to pour continuous volleys across the decks of the Serapis. It was instant death to any British sailor who tried to touch a brace, sheet, or halyard. Their forecastle was soon abandoned by officers and men alike. Then the Alliance returned to the scene of the battle. Captain Landai moved in close to the Bonhomme Richard and fired a broadside into her stern. Jones was dumbfounded at Landai's treachery. 3 times the sister ship fired at the Bonhomme Richard, but the treacherous Landai merely spurred Jones on. By this time, the condition of the Richard was desperate. Fire had broken out in the lower deck, and the flames were eating their way toward the powder magazine. The water in the hold was 5 feet deep. The ship was slowly sinking. The Commodore now suggested dropping hand grenades through the Serape's main hatch into the lower tier. Midshipman Fanning, acting gunner, and 2 seamen were ordered aloft into the main top. Armed with 2 buckets of grenades and a slow match, these 4 men lay out on the yardarm. The hatch was only partly open, leaving a hole not more than 2 feet wide, but the main yard of the Bonhomme Richard overhung it. Fanning's first 2 grenades missed, but the third one went into the opening. A terrible explosion followed. The hatch of the British frigate was blown high into the air, and more than 50 men were killed or maimed, and the after part of the lower tier was silenced. Just as the crew of the Bonhomme Richard was wildly cheering this exploit, the Alliance bore down for the second time upon her sister ship. Coming up within musket shot, she again raked and shattered the sorely distressed vehicle, and was flying her own colors. Jones directed one of the gunners to aim for the main mast of the Serapis. The mast wavered. Another shot, and it sloughed, crashing into the sea, throwing up a geyser of spray far above the deck. The Commodore stood by with a picked party of boarders. Armed with pistols and cutlasses, every man was ready for the last act. Jones now gave the signal, and the men under the command of the acting lieutenant, John Mayrant, plunged over the hammock netting and down into the forehold of the Serapis. Meeting with little opposition, they were soon in full possession and rushed toward the quarterdeck. Seeing the hopelessness of resistance, Captain Pearson struck his colors. His first lieutenant rushed up a moment later and asked, "Has the enemy struck, sir?" "No, sir. I have struck," replied Pearson with his tears in his eyes. It was the first time the British flag on a man of war was ever struck to the stars and stripes. The Bonhomme Richard was sinking rapidly now. 7 feet of water filled her hold. The pumps, manned by British prisoners, were beginning to choke. Fire broke out everywhere. Jones turned his attention to the transferring of the wounded and prisoners. He and the less than 100 men who were not wounded worked all night to haul the wounded to the Serapis. In the meantime, the Alliance sailed away to avoid Jones' reprisal. But the Bonhomme Richard did not sink that night. Morning found her still afloat. She seemed like an old fighter on his deathbed, refusing to die. Suddenly she shuddered. Lower and lower she sank, till the waves were lapping close to her jib boom. There was a moment of pause, then she went down. As she plunged into the sea, her taffrail momentarily rose in the air. The last of her to sink was her waving, tattered flag, still unstruck. Thank you for getting to the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please go ahead and subscribe and like. Also, please feel free to leave a comment if you know of another book that I could use in this series. I would be very interested in that. Also, if you're interested in restoring any of the books that I have on this series, again, please reach out to me. I would love to salvage these books so that they can be used for future generations. As a reminder, this book was written down in 1950, so any inappropriate or offensive words or phrases that were used in this book do not reflect my personal or political opinions. They are just being read verbatim. Thank you again so much for getting to the end of this video. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.